Hello, how is everyone? Thumbs up. So cold. It's like how somehow I feel like we skipped fall. So fall was really just like a week of the wildfires. And then all of a sudden we're into winter really quickly. It's good to see folks again. On. I want to get a kind of a poll for myself before we start class. How are people doing on the scavenger hunt? Feel free to unmute yourself and say yay or nay. Yes.
I'm ready to upload my next set of 5 pictures.
Nice.
I'm having a hard time finding e-scooters.
Maybe you need to get on one yourself.
Yeah, I've done that in the town of Portland a few times. I live out in Portland and they're harder to find out here. I've seen a couple, I just haven't hopped on them yet.
Yeah. How are people doing on their projects? Feel free to mute yourself and share.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like I've been pretty slow going so far. Like I haven't really crossed many bridges yet, but I feel like what I chose is for difficult to cross bridges. So I think it'll be okay. I want to find out about like the jurisdiction thing between ODOT and PBOT and how that works and how they interact with each other during the project.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because it differs.
Good luck.
Huh?
Good luck on finding that out. I've never understood it myself.
Thanks, Open.
So I'm gonna put Mosri, aka Michael Espinoza tonight. Put up the agenda. We're gonna just go through it really briefly as I open up the class and hand it over to our guest speakers. We are here again, week 5. This is the one week all of them I've been really interested in, but the one that is most different from all the others and is very critical for what we're going through now is COVID and its impacts on traffic and how that's changed over time. It's going to be very, it's going to be a really good class. So I will, like I said, I'm going to open the class. I will introduce our guest speakers from PBOT, and we will have a break. And in the second session, we will talk about the homework assignment, which I thought was kind of one of the coolest homework assignment ever. Is a good complaint. Like, what is a really good complaint? So I have to thank you, Peter Koonce, for letting us have that platform so we could talk about other complaints in the city, traffic complaints. When you're a traffic engineer and people know what you do, what they really want to share with you is how they navigate around the city and how you can do better. So I want to bring my 2 PBOT friends, Peter Koonce. He will be speaking. He'll lead the class essentially. Peter is our traffic signals traffic division manager, and we go way back from high school, so actually. So, and Peter's raised here in Portland, I think born here in Portland too, but very local guy. And he will be joined with his colleague, Alison, who is also with the agency, and she's our senior engineering associate there. And she will be going through quite a bit of data for our analysis, the analysis that they put together during this whole COVID period from March to this point. And then in the afternoon, in the later session after the break, we'll talk about your traffic complaint and go through there. So I had received a comment from one of the students regarding some time spent after class is over. So Mosri and I will stay at least 5 minutes after class is over to just have a follow-up conversation, and then we can go from there. I don't want to keep you too late, mainly because it is late and days are getting shorter, and we're definitely into, feels like winter, freezing winter these days. But yeah, so this is where we are with class. Mosri, if you could take away the, yeah, perfect. And I will let Peter have the floor. Peter, you can unmute yourself and start. Let us know when you're ready for our presentation to be up. Okay. Your audio is not working. Uh-oh. Can you hear Peter, or is it just me who can't hear Peter? You can't hear Peter. Okay. Uh-oh. You might want to log out and log back on. Alison, do you want to get started first on your piece? I think that we could do that.
Sure, yeah. I guess, Peter, there's a phone number. I actually had to call in. My city computer doesn't do well with the audio either. But yes, if you want to do my presentation first, I think Peter would have given some kind of helpful background overview, but you'll just have to imagine what it was like to hear all that first before we dive into the data. So do you have the presentation?
Yeah, Mosri, can you bring up, it'll be presentation number 2. And one of the cool things that we also want to talk about maybe during break is what we brought up from what came about from the pretest survey. Peter's mic just broadcasted momentarily. Okay. So Alison, I think I'll let you go.
Okay, great. Can you maybe put it in full screen? I'm not sure who's controlling, but that might be helpful to see some of the later charts.
There we go.
Okay, great. So yeah, my name is Alison Tanaka, and I work in Peter's group at the City of Portland. I have only been there since the beginning of the year, so it was kind of the perfect time to jump into some of this COVID response because I think I had about 2 months before we all started working from home. So it's been quite the year, and the city's been doing quite a bit with regards to the tracking, especially for traffic related to COVID. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. If you want to go to the next slide, I thought that I would give some context about what the city is doing overall. So Peter and I work with the signals and street lighting and ITS at the city, but there's lots of other groups that are working on our response. So you've probably seen some of these things around Portland, like the neighborhood greenways being closed except to local traffic to promote more space for people biking and walking. There's also been the Healthy Businesses permits that are providing space for restaurants and different shops to expand into the street so that there's more outdoor space. And then we've also been working on busy streets, which is an expansion of some of the sidewalks and the curbs so that there's more space to be able to move about the public right of way. And then our signals and street lighting group has really been involved more from a traffic data collection perspective, and we're using that for a lot of different things. It actually started because the state epidemiologist asked us for some information about how traffic was changing with COVID. And our team has detection all over the city, which I'll go over in a few minutes. And so they started out by asking our team if we had any information that we could share. Because as I'll get into, a lot of groups at the city collect data, but we had been tracking it for many years. And so we had data that went back before COVID, which was kind of an important element to be able to compare to. But we've also been using that information as private developers are trying to do their traffic studies and determine how things will change as they add businesses to the city. We've also been looking at different signal timing changes. So as traffic has been changing, our engineers are using some of the information that we're collecting to make decisions about if they should change the timing to accommodate things that are happening now, and when they might want to change it back to what it was like before COVID. And then the city in general is using some of this information for projections to look at how traffic is going to be impacting things like parking revenue and things like that. So if you go to the next slide, I thought I would maybe start with how we actually collect data through our signals and street lighting group. So if you go to the next slide, one of the main ways that we do this is through loop detection. I don't know how many of you all have noticed these, but we have them installed at a lot of intersections around the city outside of our downtown core. And they help us operate our signalized intersections, any intersection with the green, yellow, and red lights. They help us know if a vehicle or a bicyclist or a pedestrian is waiting at an intersection. But we can also use them to help us determine how many of those users are at an intersection. And so we have these loop detectors that are in the pavement, and they're inductive loops, and they tell us if a vehicle is there or not, or if a bicyclist is there or not. So you can see examples of that on the left and right side. If you go to the next screen. Another common way that we've been starting to collect traffic count data is through our radar detection. And so this is an above ground technology, and we essentially draw little zones with a software program. So instead of there being a physical loop in the pavement, we use radar technology to be able to see if a vehicle or a cyclist is at the intersection. And then I did mention pedestrians, and we use the push buttons most of the time to collect data about how many pedestrians are at an intersection, how many people are walking. And so if you go to the next slide, all of that information about the vehicles, about bicyclists, and about people walking kind of get collected in our traffic signal cabinets. So there's one of these at every signalized intersection, and you can see there's a whole jumble of wires in there that go out to the physical pieces of equipment at our intersections. And then there's a box kind of in the middle, a large black box there that essentially works as a computer to not only operate how the lights change green, yellow, red, but also can help us collect data about when those detectors are going on and off. So if you go to the next slide, and then maybe the next, looking at where our counts were taken, we have those in pavement loops installed throughout the city. The best way that we can collect data about vehicles going over them, vehicles or cyclists, is to install them on the far side of an intersection so that people aren't stopped over top of them. It's better if we can get an on and then an off signal to do a count. And so we have that type of loop detector installed at many locations, which you can see in the map on the left side here. And what we ended up doing was selecting 8 of those locations. We needed a couple of things for our COVID analysis. We needed there to be data that was available before COVID, and we also needed those detectors to have a high communication quality, because even though vehicles might be going over top of them, if we aren't able to communicate to those computers, those controllers in the field, we can't get high quality data back. So we needed both of those things to be present, and we ended up choosing 8 locations that had both of those things. So if you go to the next slide, we ended up combining those 8 locations that we had from the physical loops in the ground with some locations where we installed tube counts. So you probably noticed in different parts of the city, we have those black pneumatic tubes that go across the roadway. There's usually 2 of them, so we can tell which direction a vehicle is traveling. And those are able to give us counts as well. We normally install them on a temporary basis if there's a project that's going on in order to see how many vehicles are maybe traveling on a corridor. But for this COVID situation, we installed them sort of throughout the city on a longer term basis than we would normally. So we have these 2 sources of count data that we could use to track our COVID traffic volumes. So if you go to the next slide, and then maybe the next one, we wanted to look at how traffic has changed this year. So this is daily traffic volume data from those 8 locations where we have the physical in the ground loops. So you can see that traffic changes on a weekly basis. So there's sort of like small bumps for each of those colors. And with those are sort of weekday volumes versus weekend volumes. So every weekend there's a dip in the traffic volumes that are coming through. So you can see that over the course of the whole year, we had a really steep drop off in March when the stay-at-home order was issued. So ever since then, traffic has been slowly creeping back up. But then we had the wildfires, which also resulted in a pretty big dip in traffic just a few weeks ago. So if you go to the next slide, we started to take that daily data and try to figure out a way to normalize it, because some of our locations are in low traffic areas, some are in high traffic areas. And you can see that there is a big difference between all those different count locations on the previous slide. So we needed a way to see like how traffic volumes were really changing. That was what everyone was most interested in, was how much has traffic been reduced as a result of COVID, and then how much is it creeping up each week. And so what we ended up doing was comparing our data to a baseline. And for the loop locations that we had data from many previous years, we ended up looking at a baseline from earlier this year before COVID, before March. And then for our 2 count locations, in a lot of cases, our baseline was from previous years when we had taken account for a project. And we normalized all of that so that we had this sort of 0 point that we were comparing against for all of our locations. And you can see that for all of the locations, the traffic was somewhat variable, but in general, our traffic took that steep dive in March and then has been climbing up, and then we had the wildfires when there was another dip, and now it's kind of getting back to the percentage reduction that it was before the wildfires. So we're kind of sitting at a 20% reduction across the city still. So you go to the next slide. This is a little bit cleaner view of that reduction. So you can see in March, we were down to about a 40% reduction, and then it's been steadily climbing. And then with the wildfires, dropped to 30% of what it was pre-COVID. And now we're back to about 20%. And these are numbers that we send every couple of weeks to the state epidemiologist to add into their model of tracking how COVID is impacting not just traffic, but kind of overall for the state. So if you go to the next slide, and maybe the next one, our counts have really been focused on traffic, but I also wanted to mention that there's a lot of other groups that are also providing and tracking information related to COVID for other modes. So for transit, we have TriMet, who has this weekly reporting website that they do for their Max and West boardings. So you can see very similar trend of this drop off in March, but their boardings really haven't been increasing as much as vehicle traffic. So if you go to the next slide, there's also groups that are tracking bicycle trends. I think Michael Espinoza might actually be involved with some of this bike town data. And they have information that shows the trips that are taken And the chart on this left side here shows trends over the course of the last year. So you can see there's been a bit of a decline in the bike share rides as well, similar to our traffic volume trends. And then there's also bridge bicycle counts that are available. So there's tubes installed on most of the bridges that are counting our bicycle trips. And there's a website, a public website that you can go to and take a look at how volumes are changing over time for those as well. And if you go to the next slide, one other thing I wanted to mention was the pedestrian activity. So we are in the process at the city of developing a system so that we can collect data on the number of times when our pedestrian push buttons are hit. And so this was sort of a test of that. We have the capability at a few intersections right now, and we're hoping to expand it to more. But this was looking at over the course of March at the test intersections that we have, how the push button presses were changing throughout March. So the first couple bars are, as March, I think each one is a week of data. So looking at how traffic is changing as March goes on. And really, we're just interested in how much pedestrian activity was potentially being reduced. But one thing that we had to take into consideration was that pedestrian volumes might not actually be reducing. It might just be that people are not wanting to touch something that's sitting out on the street without proper hand sanitization. So we decided to take this with a grain of salt, but it's something that we want to be tracking at the city citywide at some point. So if you go to the next slide, I think, oh yeah, the last thing I'll mention is just the limitations and opportunities that we've come up against as we've been going through this COVID data processing. Some of the sort of lessons learned across the city have really been that it's important to be collecting this data, not just when an emergency happens, but beforehand so that we have a baseline to compare against. We also have a lot of legacy hardware in the field that we're working to upgrade, but as you saw from some of the photos, that equipment is a physical piece of equipment, and sometimes those go out. There's lots of wires that can have problems malfunctioning. And so there's a lot of things that could potentially cause us not to get the high quality data that we need. So working to upgrade our equipment. And then also across the city, we also just have a lot of different sources of data and ways to report it. And so the city in general is looking at ways to be able to better collaborate between groups and provide that data, not only within the city, but also out to the public. And then also looking at available data for all of our modes. So today I sort of focused a lot on the vehicle traffic, but we want to make sure that we have data for everyone moving through our streets. So those are some of the things that we're going to be working on moving forward. And if you go to the next slide, I think that was it for me. So I guess, Joy, I don't know how you normally run the class, if you want to do questions now or if you want to do them before the break.
It really depends. No, we did a swap between you and Peter, but we do have time for you to take some questions. So how about we do that? We'll take some questions from your piece. But Peter's been fantastic on the other in the chat room, taking live questions as well. So yeah, let's maybe spend maybe a few minutes and I can ask Elise to go through 2 questions specific to Alison's presentation. Oh yeah, Peter, you want to go ahead and check your audio? Oh no, still not working.
Peter, you're muted.
You're muted. Do you want to hop on via your phone? Try that. In that case, then Alison will take questions. Because this happened when Sam was on last time too. So Peter, if you hop on via your phone, we can test it again. In the meantime, we can take questions from Alison's presentation. Oh, you are on. Wait. Do you have students? Do you have
Okay.
questions? Oh, is Peter on?
All right. I think I'm here.
Oh, finally. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, good. I think I'm not. I think I'm on mute. I think Zoom hasn't unmuted me, so I'll just go off the phone. This will be great.
Okay. Okay. So there is a question for Allison. Phil had asked, Allison, do you access the data only for reporting and ad hoc analyses purposes, or apply any machine learning or OWL tools to uncover patterns? That's in the chat.
Yeah, for AI, yeah. So the city doesn't have any AI installed that I know of. Peter might know of some, but that is sort of like next generation, and we I guess I've been tracking it because there's a lot of research going on right now related to bringing this data in and making better decisions, especially related to the signal timing, which I think Peter will talk a little more about, and just timing in general. But the way that we give our green time to different movements, to different modes, I mean, those are decisions that are made by a person currently. And so there is a lot of research happening about using this data that comes in. And I mean, I didn't get into the data specifics, but it's tenth of a second resolution. So it's sort of everything that's happening at our intersection, every light that's changing color, every detection zone that's being activated, all of that data comes back to us. And we have a way to visualize it now, but we don't have an underlying machine that's using it to make decisions. But that is something, I guess, that the industry is moving towards.
Awesome. Thanks, Allison. Great presentation.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Thanks.
Shall we?
Yeah, anything else, or do you want to hand it over to Peter?
Do I hand it over to Peter? Yeah. And then Alison will stay for Q&A. So Peter, do you wanna hop on?
Sure. I think the challenge could be that my phone will come up as a screen like that. So maybe we should just quickly go to my presentation, and that will. So if I can bring that up, can I share my screens?
No, Malsri is gonna share your screen. So could you share Peter's presentation? It's the number one. There we go. Could you do a screen,
Okay.
a slideshow? Thank you.
All right. So, well, like I said, I guess like I was trying to say, thanks everybody for having me. As Twee mentioned, I'm a native Portlander, so I grew up here. We'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then talk about performance measures, and try to tie back into some of the questions that we asked you in that survey. So, and feel free to jump into the chat. I actually teach at Portland State in the summer, and experience Zoom as a teacher. So, sat in Twee's shoes to teach some undergraduates a transportation engineering course, which was challenging to say the least. So, I haven't had audio problems before though, so this is sorry for the challenges at the start here. So next slide, please. So you've had some interesting, I think, range of people speaking, and so the first thing I'll say is that these slides are really my opinion, and they're not the express views of the city of Portland. We have some difference of opinion. I work for the city, but I also have my own personal opinion. So that'll come through in the presentation. Next slide. So who am I? Well, I'm a product of Portland Public Schools. So keep going through the slides. So I went to Benson, to Northeast Portland. I grew up in North Portland. As a student, this is before Portland State had such a national reputation as a transportation leader. I went to Oregon State just down the road. I left Oregon State. It was an intern at TriMet for a little bit. And then I joined Kittleson Associates, a consulting firm. So I like Twee as a consultant for a while. I actually went and did my graduate work at Texas Transportation Institute down in College Station, Texas, a very small town, pretty conservative. I was probably the most liberal person in my class by far. And then that's where I recognized that there was a lot of evil in transportation. And I'll explain what I mean by that, because some of the research that's done is very focused on moving cars. It's not really consistent with our policies in Oregon. So you'll see some of that in this lecture. I did work across the country, did a lot of work in DC, and then I teach at Portland State. That's one of my the fun things I like to do. And then I also work for the city. The next slide. So Portland has a good reputation of having a livable downtown. And so I'll just talk a little bit about the history, just a little bit, because I think you've heard a little bit about that, but maybe just from my perspective of what frames the work that I do. Next slide. So it starts back in the 1900s. So I don't know how many of you know, I see a couple nodding heads, know what this building is. Michael does. Give Michael extra credit for today. So this is the old Portland Hotel. Anybody know where the Portland Hotel was? All right, go to the next slide. So Portland Hotel got bulldozed in the 70s. So the hotel that was the landmark hotel in downtown Portland got bulldozed. So you know that's that old song that says, "Pave paradise and put in a parking lot." Portland did that. We actually did that. And if you look, let's see if you can, so there's a parking lot. Can you recognize the building on the left and the top? That building's still there today. So that's Pioneer Courthouse Square. So we literally bulldozed the best hotel in the entire city, the most historic hotel, and put in a parking lot for Nordstrom. At that time in the 70s, we were trying to compete with the suburbs, and needing parking was the number one thing that the business owners talked about. Next slide. So obviously, maybe now you know the story. We realized that was a bad idea, and we reclaimed that space for Pioneer Square. Next slide. And of course, that Pioneer Square is part of the history of planning. And so this 1972 document really, as someone that's a good study, likes to study history, was wondering, boy, a kid from Portland who grew up here, kind of had some semblance that Portland was a little different. Going to Texas, where there was really no there in the community, we helped to realize that Portland was different. Portland was planning back in the 70s. And the transportation plan back then, the number one strategy for transportation for the central city was what? Anybody want to guess? Throw it in the chat, maybe. What do you think transportation was? What was the number one strategy? Trolley? No, it wasn't trolley. It wasn't streetcar. Move cars fast. Actually, we were smart about that. We weren't moving cars, not highways, not interstate. Portland was pushing back against all those things. We just had the freeway revolt. So the number one thing was people is close. So Julie, get a gold star. You're close to a gold star. It wasn't biking. We weren't doing biking in the 70s. Buses is close. But actually the number one strategy was housing. Getting housing in downtown, so that if you think about it from a transportation perspective, if you can put housing in downtown near where people work, the housing and transportation problem becomes very easy. Just let people walk. It's not that hard when I have a sidewalk in front of my house. I live in Selwood now. Sidewalk in front of my house, it's been there for 100 years. As an engineer and an efficiency guy, I love that. I don't have to do anything. Just let the sidewalk, just maintain it a little bit here and there. Maybe make sure that there are trees that aren't too close. But that was the number one transportation strategy. Next slide. So we've had a history of planning, and so Portland has often been called the Disneyland for planners. It's everybody gets a plan, everybody gets it's where all the planning happened. So we've had plans for each mode. And then we had a climate action plan in 2009. That really guided a lot of my thinking about where we need to go. Next slide. One thing that's changed since then is Vision Zero. So Vision Zero is a big game changer for us, and it makes us think a little bit differently about this. Next slide. So Vision Zero, if I think about Vision Zero, I think about design for my kids. and actually they're behind me here in the Netherlands. When they're in the Netherlands, they don't have to think about wearing a helmet. They can just bike anywhere because everywhere is safe in the Netherlands for cycling. They've been at this since the 1970s when they realized that some of the errors in their ways of thinking about the car, they would go and focus on cycling as a part of their work. We didn't find cycling until the 90s. So we have been a little bit less, a little less quick at coming to cycling, but certainly my kids, if I think about them and think about their safety, next slide, I can think about strategies that would make them safer, but certainly you can put safety on the same pedestal as climate. And so one of the things that the Climate Action Plan said was, hey, we should measure how we're doing from a greenhouse gases standpoint. Next slide. And when we think about greenhouse gases, we know from a climate standpoint, if we follow the science, that we have to reduce greenhouse gases. So if you're not familiar with that, there's a 2050 goal. We had been doing okay in transportation relative to other people, other communities, but we know now after 10 years of having that plan that we aren't really meeting the needs. We need to be accelerating our work in transportation. That chunk of transportation greenhouse gases is actually the worst offender of not meeting the goals right now. Next slide. So what can we do? What are the elements of transportation? What, as a signals and street lighting manager, what should I do? Well, the one thing I remember asking the first day I got to the city is, hey, I've heard of LED streetlights. Why don't we do that? And my staff said, they're too expensive. They're too, we can't do it yet. And they were right. But I kept asking that same question over and over until they got sick of me. And then finally we did the math and said, oh, look, actually, they make sense. And I can say the same thing for solar on my house. And actually, we're now ordering solar for our house because the economics make sense. So that's the good news is we need to keep thinking about how do we do things differently. And LED streetlights is just one of those examples. We can talk about that a lot more and how much that saved the city. Next slide. So mode split, I asked you about mode split. So this is our current mode split. Portland has done a lot for cycling, not necessarily at the Netherlands level, but when we put together the Climate Action Plan, one of the things we did was look at peer cities. Portland leads the country in 8% bike mode split. That's the commute mode split. It's not a great measure, but it's a measure we have. And we thought, well, what can we do in the future if we really put our minds to it and adopt European design principles? And most of you knew this question. Next slide, what the 2030 goal is to get to 25% bike mode split. So that is way up there with European countries. Now, most of the great Dutch cities are in the 35 or 40% range. So we're 25% means that we have to do a lot. And if we can get to 8% with bike lanes, the challenge of, well, how do we get from 8% to 25% is, well, we complete the network and we build better bike lanes, so protected bike lanes. And so I'll talk a little about how we've done that. The other thing that you can scratch your head a little bit on this is transit and how that has grown. And so one of the aspects, this would be obviously better in a classroom than a virtual setting, is thinking about, well, why aren't we tripling the transit mode split? Why aren't we as bullish on transit? And so you can ponder that a little bit, but I'll give you the answer. The reason we're not as bullish on transit is because transit costs quite a bit of money to run. So biking is a little bit less difficult for a public agency to pay for and to deliver, if you think about it. So we're pretty bullish on cycling. We're thinking about it like a European community. Of course, transit is also in there, and the other modes are there as well. Why aren't we as focused on walking? Great question. The reason we don't think that walking can grow beyond 8%, because that'd be easy to say, well, let's just do walking. Let's just assume tripling walking. But walking, we are not as dense as a European city. So we think because we're not very dense, the walking trips can't grow as much. So that's, we're being a little bit realistic that walking is not going to grow as much as cycling. We are spread out, so making 2 mile or 3 mile trips, I might walk that, but not everybody's willing to walk that. So we focus on cycling as a higher growth percentage than walking. All right, next slide. So the transportation hierarchy that came out of the climate action plan, one of my points that I like to make is that engineers don't often read the plans. And we'll talk about that more when we get into your complaints and comments and suggestions. But I tend to like plans. I guess maybe it's because I grew up in Portland and everybody's planning around me. But plans really should inform our decisions as engineers and from a maintenance function as well. And that's the nice thing about the climate action plan. It makes it very clear what the hierarchy is and how we should make decisions. And so I think one of the things, the other takeaway I want you to have is think about that when you're asking and commenting and asking for things. You can tell the city, hey, it doesn't look like you're following your transportation hierarchy. Why not? Can you sweep this bike lane? It says cycling is supposed to be number 2. Why aren't you keeping up with that maintenance need? So this picture of downtown First and Oak is one of my favorite examples where at this intersection we actually have it done pretty well. We have sidewalks that are relatively clear. I could argue that we should have awnings so when it's raining they don't get wet as I walk through the city. But certainly from a cycling standpoint, we have a whole lane. We actually now have painted that all green so it's more clear to cars. We have transit covered not on this street but on the side street, the intersecting street. We take care of commercial vehicles by allowing them to park. And of course, we have plenty of single occupant vehicles. One of the questions, I think it was Paul Buchanan asked was, well, what's with all the cars on all the streets? And so we'll get to that later. Next slide. So the first thing when you're interacting with a traffic engineer, and I'd be curious of Twee's perspective on this too, is that the reason I got in this was not to learn about traffic signals and things that Alison just showed you, but it was to build bridges. I thought the Golden Gate Bridge and all the bridges in Portland were amazing, right? That is the stuff that traffic engineers, that really civil engineers get involved in. So I was so focused on bridges. And what's the number one thing when you're building a bridge? What do you never want to have happen? Pretty easy, right? Next slide. You never want it to fail. So we can define failure. Failure is, I love to always point at Washington, that Seattle-Portland rivalry. We always go, oh, look at what Washington's doing, ha, ha, ha. Not really, I'm not going to laugh at them. But they had a bridge failure, right? They had a truck hit the bridge. Luckily, nobody was killed in this. But they had a bridge failure. I can define what failure is, and that's what civil engineers like to do. We don't want signal poles to fall over. We don't want buildings to fall over. We don't want structures like this to fall over. But what is failure for a traffic engineer? How do we define that? Next slide. All right, here's your quiz. So, get out your pencils. Here's your Jeopardy. We play like Jeopardy with our traffic engineers, our students. So I'll take traffic level service 101 for 100. Go ahead, next slide. So that's the question. What is failure? And so I have to ask, that's the answer, right? So that I have to ask it in the form of an answer. It's highway capacity mail. That's what we use. Defines failure as the breakdown of flow. So what is that threshold? And I asked you this poll question, so I'll give you the answer now. Next slide. It's 80 seconds per vehicle. The magic number that we have defined in the highway capacity manual. 80 seconds per vehicle. So think about that a little bit. What does that mean? So you're sitting at an intersection. After 80 seconds, you can call me up on the phone now and say, Peter, you failed 81 seconds. What is going on? Why are you failing all the time? And here's my answer in reply to that. Next slide. That's a terrible measure. I hate that measure. 80 seconds of delay per vehicle. Okay. The problem with that measure is that it doesn't even consider people. It's just considering vehicles. And when I say vehicles, when I define vehicles from the highway capacity manual, it's not thinking about bikes at all. It is only thinking about cars. And that's our problem as an industry, is we need to think about people. So we are thinking about people. And the other thing that we'll introduce, because obviously we're thinking about that more and more as inequities. Historical inequities are things that we have not traditionally considered, and we need to be as we think to the future. Next slide. Okay, so, and we don't think about bike improvements. So one of the examples, somebody said, this is my favorite signal. I love it because I'm surrounded by bikes and I feel safe. You're right. That's exactly the sort of conditions we create. And some of the tools that we have think about these things. And that's some of the tools we're just making up as we go. So that's the good news. We're willing to think outside the box and we're not just using our standards. Next slide. So that is part of the issue. Our standards don't accept 80 seconds of delay per vehicle. We need to think about how do we move people. Next slide. And then the other part of that is we need to think about safety. Our measures don't always think about safety, and that's another part that's really coming into our consciousness now. Next slide. Racial equity is the issue of the day. It's something that the city has been doing work on, and it obviously with the current protests, we are listening and we are learning. And so I often say, boy, before this year, I had what I thought were the answers. And from a equity standpoint, I am learning more and more each day. And I'll commit to you that we'll keep working at that and be better listeners in the community when we come to you with ideas of what transportation looks like in the future. Next slide. The good news is we have a racial equity plan. The bad news is it's not very transportation specific. Next slide. So just like we did with the climate action plan, I've been thinking a lot about how do I respond as an engineer to these challenges. I want to reflect on my bias. That's number one. I've done that with transportation and climate for a long, long time, but I'm doing that more with race and leading with racial equity in a lot of cases. I'm thinking and listening a lot more than I ever used to. I'm trying to do less problem solving and more, maybe I need to listen and analyze our efforts, amplify the voices of others, and lead with empathy. That's what I've focused on, and I'll keep trying to learn and be a better engineer in the future. Next slide. Alison and I have done some analysis of things that are very basic, like where are we doing maintenance? And is our maintenance and inspection of signals are we showing an overrepresentation of our visits and to complaints in communities of color? And are people that maybe aren't as comfortable calling the government getting a requisite number of visits and proactive maintenance? And so these are the sorts of things that, boy, these are new to us, and we're trying to do a better job with that. The one thing we always have to think about is the budget implications of that and proactive maintenance versus reactive. When budgets are tight, we end up with reactive, and that's not great from an equity standpoint. My staff, we've been talking about this a lot and trying to make sure that we do a good job when we do get calls from the communities of color. These are opportunities for us to restore trust in government by providing high quality service to people that maybe aren't used to calling and complaining and getting their way. Next slide. So where do we go from here? I've posed a lot of things. I've told you there's some wrongs that we're trying to right, trying to think about these things differently. This notion of enforcement, that's a big issue for us. We're trying to figure out what our relationship is with that. How do these measures move us forward? We're asking different questions. And so, I just think about, what's bringing people to the streets and protests really, as I joined in on some of those protests, it really did hit home that we need to think differently about how we move people together and how we treat each other in the right of way. Next slide. So let's just give you a case study from the Hawthorne Bridge. I always like to try to put things in concrete. I guess, Twee, let me do a quick time check and just see if I have time for this or if I should postpone this to after a break.
Yes, you. How much time do you need for this? Is it like 5 minutes?
I can make it 5 minutes.
Can you? Okay, because I'm scheduled for a break at 7:35.
Perfect. We'll do it. Okay, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Hawthorne Bridge. This is my commute home, so this is personal to me. And I'm a bike commuter. I did your mode split calculations. You guys are very bikey, just so I'm with you. Every day I ride my bike. And so this Hawthorne Bridge, let's go back in time. Next slide. So this is the Hawthorne Bridge approaches 1957. How's that for cycling infrastructure, huh? Beautiful, smooth pavement, great old style cars just rolling on by. Okay, not great. That was built for speed. Look at those big, wide streets. That's a recipe for not safe for people walking and biking. Next slide. So we have evolved. Now this was the same. Comes from the archives. Let's see how many of you know that old red, orange, and brown awful TriMet logo. That thing is from the 80s, right? So this is the Hawthorne Bridge before it was painted. And look at the traffic control. You see a difference there? You're coming across the bridge and it just has a sign that says, yield to bikes, good luck. Everybody, good luck. Just go ahead and just yield, no problem, right? Wrong, it was terrible. Nobody rode that. So go to the next slide. So this was it. You're crossing over a highway ramp. Good luck. We actually had a bike lane back in 1991, but bikes were yielding to the car traffic. Not great. And then if you got past that first ramp, you had the second ramp. So what did we do? Next slide. Can you see what we did there? We closed the ramp to traffic. Is that a safety improvement? Yes, I'll say. Why would we have that high-speed ramp there when we want to make a good cycling infrastructure? So instead of the ramp, we put concrete over. It's a big concrete pad, and we reduced that ramp. Now, we didn't solve all the problems. We just still have that other ramp that's up there. But can you look at the traffic control there at that ramp? It's stop signs. So we're stopping the traffic that comes off the ramp instead of saying, yield, good luck. So we're being more deliberate about making good cycling infrastructure. Next slide. So the outcome, we solve that problem so that you can get to the beautiful path along the bridge. Next slide. So there it is. We've marked with green. We have stop signs. So let's go back to performance measures. What happens when you stop a ramp like that? A very heavy vehicle ramp. Next slide. You back up traffic, and you back it up a long way. So the question you have to ask is, does this match our policies? And the answer is yes. We're prioritizing people walking and biking. We're not prioritizing that ramp traffic. Now that answer gets you, well, it's gotten us as far as we are today. But what happens when you back up the ramp so far that it impacts streetcar all the way back 6 blocks away at Harrison Street? That's when you might consider a traffic signal to address that intersection. Next slide. So to get to this beautiful bike facility, it's more than just building a facility. You have to build the network. You have to build the intersections. You have to make those intersections safe. And so all those things have to come together. Next slide. So this is my commute home. Sometimes I can complain about the congestion on my commute home because it's amazing when you're surrounded by people that are biking just like you are. Next slide. And then the city's role is to measure and see what's happening. So you saw that in Alison's presentation. It takes a lot of work to measure and see what's happening, but this is where we get to. In 1992 is when the Hawthorne Bridge, we did a lot of the work on the Hawthorne Bridge. You didn't see an immediate impact in terms of number of people biking across all the bridges. In fact, it was fairly flat for several years until we got the network together, until we built up enough of a bike network and with all the neighbor greenways, all the other facilities to really grow the bike network into what it is today. And so in 2008, we reached a peak. In 2009, of course, the story in the Willamette Week was, oh my gosh, what's happening to the biking? And the good news is cycling has continued to grow in the city after 2009. I just love this data. This is when I started the city, so this is always a good memory for me. Next slide. So we want cycling to be safe. I love this picture I just captured of this guy. He's smiling. We want people smiling when they're cycling, when they're traveling. We want people to be healthy, and we want it to be something that everybody can do. Next slide. And of course, there's a lot that's in, so it's beyond 2009. I told you that about that bump in the road. We continue to grow, and I need to update this slide, but it's continued to be something that the city has worked on year over year. So these things take time to build. Next slide. And that's it. Was that 5 minutes? How am I doing for time?
Right on. That was awesome. Thank you.
You have to expect the guy that's in charge of signal timing to be cognizant of how much time he's taking.
To be right on. Yeah. I would love to take a break, but I know Peter's just loaded with like so much wisdom. So I don't know if you guys want to stay on. If Peter, if you want to stay on for a break to take questions, we don't get you very often, just like everybody else. But let's break for about 10 minutes. And what you could do is just do the questions in the chat room, and we can do what we can to answer. So let's do that.
Sounds great.
Take a break. Yeah. And Peter had asked why I got into engineering. We didn't plan for failure, but here we are. So, okay. Yeah, let's take a break. And if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Thank you.
Peter, I was able to answer a few of the questions in the chat, but I think Carrie's was the first one I wasn't sure about, so maybe start there when you're scrolling back through.
All right, will do.
This is awesome. Thank you, Peter. And Alison. Individual breaks.
Oh, I see Phil's comment on LEDs. Phil, are you, I think I'll be faster if I just, looks
Yeah.
like you're off mute.
No scares anyway.
Okay, good. Yeah, LEDs. The LEDs, when I first asked the question, the fixtures were about $800 a piece. And we kept watching the cost of those. And some cities, some big cities jumped in. So Seattle was doing some work, and we were talking to them. And then LA was the other city. They got a big federal grant, and that helped to really ramp up the suppliers. And so that dropped the price down to about $200, $240 is what we estimated. And then the next year after we went out to bid, the price was like 160. So we actually saved a lot of money by doing that and by taking the risk to take that on.
Does it have to make money for you guys? Is that part of the business case, or save money? Or do you factor in the avoided cost of injuries and such like that?
It was, so it was interesting because PG is one of Sam Adams' last acts. He was, PGE wanted to do it for the city. So we had an interesting debate on whether the city should continue to own those streetlights or whether PGE should do it like they do for the other counties throughout the region. And we argued, well, if those savings are higher, who gets that money? And it turned out the city got the money if the savings were higher. And the city took on the risk themselves. So that was a good decision at the end of the day.
That's interesting. I had no idea that utilities sometimes own and operate streetlights. That's I don't want to take up all the question time, but that's one I'd love to ask you more about that sometime.
All right. I see Paul's question, goals about COVID. Yeah, we don't revisit those goals very quickly, but certainly it's got to shift the needle towards more telecommuting and thinking more broadly about that. I think I answered Robin's question. Good to see you on the call, Robin.
I have another question, but I'm not actually in the class, so I don't want to populate it. Take over.
You know how to get a hold of me.
Exactly.
Good to hear your voice.
Yeah, I like to
when-
pop in. I've known Twee for a long time. I like to pop in every so often.
Everybody knows Twee. And is Matt online as well? Oh my God.
Yeah,
Like an
Matt
all-star
is
panel.
here. Hey, Matt, if you're on, you can put your video on. And yeah, I sent you a private message, Peter, saying that Matt's on. He's probably on break.
He's late in Toronto.
He's been coming on. Yeah, he said this is one he did not want to miss.
Well, that's
Yeah.
That's flattering. Julie, you said Hawthorne Bridge facilities make me so sad. What would you say would make them better?
She on? I think I sent everybody to break.
That's good. That's good. I would say, yeah, I remember walking across the bridge, and it was basically the sidewalk was 4 feet wide with streetlight poles as a part of that 4 feet. So it was I always think back of what that was when the first time I walked across it, and it was harrowing.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, Rye asked the question about Tillicum Crossing. Yeah, we can talk about that. Wow. That was, boy, that's a great story of making a connection. I mean, talk about a history of a project there. That's wonderful.
Yep.
Peter, one that I missed up above, Carrie was wondering about the bike counts and why those didn't happen this summer, and I wasn't sure.
Oh, the volunteer bike counts. Yeah, great question. I don't know either. I think there was some hesitation of working with volunteers, not knowing how to deal with COVID. I think I had not heard about it, so that is something that Roger Geller and maybe Michael Espinoza would be the best people to talk about.
Counts are actually happening right now through Bike Loud. Has been doing them last month and this month at Slow Street network intersections.
Yeah, no, Bike Loud's doing them at Slow Streets, but it just seems like a bummer because some of the official city intersections have been counted for like a decade now, and so if not more, and the fact that they weren't done this summer is a bummer in terms of a long-term data set, as somebody who loves data like you guys do. And I was just
we'll have the two counts.
But I can totally see there's like reasons behind it, like safety reasons and all kinds of things. But I just was curious if you guys knew why.
Yeah, we'll still have the two counts over all the bridges and at select locations. So it's a good point. The data is very useful.
Somebody asked if you have a favorite bridge.
Well, I'll have to say that the Tillicum Crossing was kind of the bridge that I left consulting for, so that's got to be up there. That was a project that I as a TriMet intern in 1995. I remember studying South-North corridor, which was supposed to be Interstate Max and Orange Line combined, and when we went out to the regional measure, we actually did not get that passed. And then we ended up having to cut that line in two. So the yellow line came first, which replaced the old bus line 5 that I used to ride to high school. And then the orange line came later, and that bridge was really the reason why ILF Consulting is wanting to make sure that got through, make sure that that bridge was the best design that it could be, given the challenging set of circumstances that were kind of presented to us, and that cycling would be as good as it could possibly be with all the challenges of all the rail tracks at that intersection. So that was a fascinating project, and has always been definitely as a highlight of my career. Now, the thing that you don't realize with the Tillicum crossing is that the impact of that grade. And that wasn't my decision, of course. That was the Coast Guard's decision of how the grade across the river should be laid out. So that 5% is it's long and steady, and I think that's one of the reasons that it's not well. And OHSU hasn't grown quite as much as we had anticipated. So, but I say that's one of the highest. It's one of the best bridges because it's quiet, and it's a beautiful view. Oh, I like the Fremont Bridge too at the top of the bridge pedal. That is definitely a treat. St. John's. Oh, St. John's. Can we get a road guide on St. John's? That should be somebody's project to work with ODOT on why they're so against a road diet that would absolutely work just fine. Like I said, these are not the views of the City of Portland employee, Peter Koonce. This is some other person. But that project, I bike over the St. John's Bridge on occasion, and that's begging for better bike facilities.
It's a beautiful bridge, and internationally, that's what Portland was originally known for, was the St. John's Bridge before the Tillicum. Why isn't there a tunnel on the west end? Huh.
The west end of the Tillicum?
Oh, St. John's.
St. John's. Oh, that definitely predates me. I have no idea.
Tunnel from where to where?
That intersection feels like an urbanist's practical joke.
I mean, it's a little bit like the Selwood Bridge. It just kind of cuts into that hillside, and then obviously you go up to the cemetery if you're going to continue west. And that's there was a lot of work on that. That bridge was almost as the work on the hillside was almost as expensive as the work on the bridge.
So let's get started. I know the chat room is really busy tonight, which is great. Getting conversations from the chat in here. We are almost an hour left, and I would love to continue on the class and talk about your homework assignment and the traffic complaint that was brought up. I think this is a really good opportunity to do some Q&A and discussion on what how you navigate through the city and what are your biggest complaints. And Peter, since I sent you those questions, that list, I received 4 more, so I just emailed it to you.
Right.
Yeah. Do you want us to start the slideshow with your second presentation?
I mean, if you can enable me to share, I actually updated my presentation a little bit. So
oh, you did?
Either way.
Will you be able to give Peter or not? I don't remember. I think it may just be her who could do it.
I can make him
Okay.
the co-host, and then yeah,
Okay.
I can try to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, so
looks
Peter
like
is
it's
the
working.
co-host now.
There we go.
Can you see?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. See if that works. So, all right. Well, thanks again for having me. The one thing I will say, I'm just trying to, I have my slideshow on, and so I can't see you right now. So let me try to, I'll just go from this, okay? So I always say that you don't have traffic complaints. I want to make them traffic compliments, because often your complaints are something that we actually need to fix. And I find that users, okay, there are the people that just complain, but generally speaking, the feedback that we get are generally pretty good. I mean, every once in a while, it's like, oh, why didn't we think of that? So I think, and especially if they are focused on our policies. So now that you know our secrets of our policies, you just got to frame the question in the right way. So I went through what you said, and I'll just say, yeah, that's the key. I think that's the secret sauce, is that sometimes within the public sector, we undervalue the feedback we get. But that's also because, the citizens may not know what the policies are. So when you're asking for something that we have budget for and that are consistent with our policies, it's a lot easier to navigate the system. So those but sometimes there are actions that conflict with our policies. And obviously there are some classic examples of that happening right now between our friends at the Oregon Department of Transportation and the city of Portland. I don't have to go into details. I think you all know some of those maybe that are happening right now. Okay, so it's trying to navigate. So if you were to say, hey, Peter, I can't navigate this traffic signal here because I don't know where to put my bike to be detected, I would be, well, oh, okay, yeah, we got a grant for putting in new stencils. We'll come by and we'll do that. Or if you were blind, I have a soft spot for somebody that's blind. I was in a training program where they put a blindfold on me and said, go navigate this traffic signal. And I found myself scared out of my mind. Like, how would I ever do that? So when somebody that's blind calls me, we get our electrician there to fix that signal and put in the locator tone as quickly as we can get around to it. That's just ranks right up there as something that I just want our agency to be able to do. So that is, I think those are two examples of things that we can just do because that's the right thing to do. Okay, but a lot of you, nobody asked me for, I don't know that any of you are blind. It's hard, you can't really, it's hard to tell. So nobody asked me that. So I'll just go through these comments and questions, and I'm sorry I didn't see the 4 that you just added. So, but one of the suggestions was distracted driving, and I think like Michael and Steve, you guys both had this. So yes, distracted driving. I worry about that cycling around all the time, and I think that is going to be the next crash that I have. Luckily, knock on wood, I haven't had a crash, but I do worry about drivers that are distracted. And what can I do? Well, not much. I mean, I always suggest to our legislature team that we need help. We need laws that make that a more of a priority. My wife was in a crash, and we, it was a 2-lane road next to Reed College, and the person turned in front of her and hit her, a left turn right in front of her. And the only thing we can think of is he was distracted. I mean, how do you do that? Like, you can't see the headlights, and she was driving at the time. So, is that a police enforcement issue? The police person that responded did not even ask about cell phones. So, it just is what it is. So I'll go through these rapid fire and then we'll ask questions, I think, at the end. I think there's 12 slides, so not a lot of things. Right turn on red. Oh, Karen, yes, right turn on. What? Why are we doing that? This should be a thing. We're slow to do it because we believe there are some negatives, and there's an interest in doing it at a large scale. Actually, our previous city traffic engineer was a little bit against it. And one of his rationales was, well, the problem is when the signal turns to green and turns to walk, then the right turning vehicle goes then, and then you introduce the conflict. And I think I asked you all if you were familiar with leading pedestrian intervals. So the answer to that is, well, if you're worried about that conflict, just put in a leading pedestrian interval so I can go on the walk and not be worrying about the car that's turning in front of me. So yes, let's do turn on red, and yes, let's do leading pedestrian intervals. That's all consistent with our policy. If you were to ask the city of Portland to do that, and we would say no, I would scratch my head. I would be surprised if we would say no to that. I think we would have to say yes, and that'd be a pretty simple thing to do. Hopefully that's a good answer for all y'all. Okay, drivers stopping at stop signs. This is my wife's number one complaint. And my answer to her, and I'll give this to you, Julie, as well, is yes, it's annoying. But the good news is it's not the riskiest behavior. So our response will be, we're going to focus on the riskier things that are going on. And it's not a great response, but we do have, it's kind of the big fish to fry. And my wife hates that answer. I can't imagine that you like that answer any better. But it is a function of risk. We kind of think about, okay, where is the risk? And you know, when we think about Vision Zero, we do focus a lot on the highest risk locations. So that's not a good answer, but it's a limited resources answer. All right, that probably was the worst answer I'm going to give. So maybe Julie, if you want to chime in, I'll let you have the mic. You can yell at me. Okay, you can yell at me later. But the other thing I'll say is I'm not in the striping crew. I'm only the signals guy, so you can always deflect those questions. All right, traffic signal timing too short for cyclists. Carrie Leonard I'm a fan on Twitter. Carrie always has insightful comments. These are the sorts of things. It's like, this is mining the gold. Carrie, yes, I've given that feedback. Hopefully you have too, and hopefully our engineers will respond to that. And I've been out on 17th. I know sometimes the preemption, the train, so we're always conflicting with different things. Sometimes the preemption is the train is over there on the left. So sometimes that does conflict, but the feedback's invaluable. So thanks for that. We'll definitely make those changes. Okay, speeding traffic. Yes, Megan and Byron. So I hate speeding traffic too. This is the number one risk factor. High speed traffic is where we have deaths. And if we're really focused on Vision Zero, then we need to be pulling out all the stops to figure out how do we curb that behavior. And like I said, automated enforcement is I think, to me, it's equitable. We're going through a process to figure out what does the community think. And I think Commissioner Hardesty was really strong in terms of making the question be clear that she was worried about exacerbating the existing relationships that we have with the community. And that is the right answer, the right question, and we don't have that answer. So we're working on that. We're being thoughtful about how we expand our system if we do expand. So more to come on that. It's also in the safety team. So this is just my opinion that we should be expanding them very thoughtfully. The good news is if with ticketing, one of the things we do with ticketing that's very, very smart is we don't want to ticket people that are lower income. So we do give the option of classes. So you can take a class and say, I've learned my lesson, and hopefully not you, and then you don't have to pay the fine. So one of the things that I've read in this era of learning more about racial equity is the new Jim Crow, and I appreciate that some of the nuances of our relationship with the community in terms of enforcement and some of the past practices the government has performed. So again, one of those deep equity questions. I don't know if I'm answering that right. And that's another reason I can say, gosh, I'm glad there are smarter people and leaders like Joanne Hardesty that are helping us and asking good questions of us. Okay, maybe I'll pause there. Actually, that's half. That was a lot. There was a lot there. So maybe I'll look at the chat real quick and see what you all are saying. Maybe let's see, where'd the chat go? Twee, you want to chime in and guide me here?
Yeah, I sent it to your work email on the
okay.
the other 4 new
Okay.
complaints.
Well, we'll see if I get those. Let's see. So, questions from the chat. So, okay, Tillicum, yes, got that one. Bill asked about the law. What law? I'm sorry.
You can skip that, Peter. It already got answered.
Isn't this
Okay, great. Oh, green time. How do I define green time? Did Alison answer that one?
She did, yes.
Yes, she did.
All right.
So Julie wrote.
Maybe I don't have any questions.
No, there's a question that if you start with Julie at 7:57, she said, I wrote about this in my survey, but there's terribly placed no turn on red sign at an intersection in my neighborhood. Why would the city go through the trouble of putting up a sign where no drivers will see it?
I can explain that. I don't know if it feels very specific to me, but if you're on Rosa Parks heading eastbound and it intersects with MLK, it's there's a turn, right turn only lane and a straight and a left turn, and it's meeting MLK, which is pretty big. And there's a bike box that used to be there. It will return, I assume. But there's the no turn on red sign for the cars. But instead of hanging up by the light, it's sitting across 4 lanes of traffic, like on the pole, where it's not visible to anyone. And it's just like, it's visible if you're standing as a pedestrian, so you can see that the cars aren't supposed to turn, but.
This is a classic silo issue. So the people that put up signs don't talk to the people that do the traffic signals. So we should fix that. You should tell us, hey, this sign doesn't make any sense. Can you put it where it should be? And there may be a good reason not to, because if you put up the sign on the traffic signal pole, it could be that's a really old pole and it can't handle the sign. But that's just one of those things where, yeah, we should do the right thing and put up the sign on the pole.
Hey, Peter, your email is on the screen share. You might want to take it off.
Oh, that's funny.
All
right.
Do you still have more from your presentation you want to share? Or you want to go into gallery mode and we can look at everyone?
I will go back to that presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, this is my favorite question. Paul asked, cars are allowed on every road. What's up with that? And the answer is, well, not necessarily. So Tillicum Crossing, we no cars there, right? Paul, check one. We got one for us. And street seats, we are doing street seats. So Ankeny, we are doing that. Decoupling cars from economic activity is hard for business owners to get around. We have one outside my, down two blocks down, so on Lexington Street, where I live, and the cart owners are like, we don't like it because it's restricting our parking. And so I've been going there and having coffee and hearing this stuff, and that's a challenge for us. We got business owners that are saying we don't want this. So one of the things that I used with my staff time the other day was, all right, staff, what's your favorite street seat, and are you going to go there and go with the businesses? So that's kind of fun. Like, let's figure out how do we go and help those businesses recognize that there's value in having car-free spaces. But it's a challenge for business owners to think about it like we do. And that's one of the challenges of, if you go to the Netherlands, so it's my background and going to the Netherlands, all the things that they're able to do, their business owners are asking them for car-free spaces because they work. That's just what they're accustomed to. Their density is higher. There's more people walking. That's all those things are set up. So it's a challenge for us to decouple the idea that economic activity is a function of how many cars you can get to your food carts or whatever it is. Okay, let's see. Next one, left turning, stopping at cars. Left turn timing and stopping cars. There was some, Phil had a question about, okay, well, gosh, what are we doing with, we're stopping the cars. It makes a slow travel path. Well, that's true. These are the trade-offs that we make. And one of the things that we are looking at, Alison, that's actually one of Alison's projects, is comparing and contrasting left turns and the left turn traffic with opposing throughs and what's the best thing. So we know things from a safety standpoint are better when you protect them and protect pedestrians. So those are the sorts of trade-offs we continue to look to make. So your feedback is useful to help us as we think about these things. We also look at the crash data. So again, shifting from being so focused on moving cars and delay and thinking about, will there be more crashes if we do it one way or another? Okay, trains on the Central East Side. The question was, gosh, why, the trains, I get blocked by the train. I think this is Mira's question. And yes, the trains were here first. They get the right of way. It's something that we are kind of stuck with, unfortunately. The trains are there. In the Netherlands, they would separate the trains. They have federal programs that figure out how to make the trains go underground and how to make the passenger trains work really well. We don't have that same level of investment from either private sector or the public sector. So I think we're stuck with the trains. And in fact, one of my favorite challenging intersections is the one over at 11th and Clinton and Gideon, where we kind of thought about that idea of grade separation, but the city decided not to grade separate that and left it at grade, which meant that the traffic signal is the most confusing, difficult traffic signal in the whole city for an engineer like me and Alison to figure out how to make that work. And I don't think it's really working very well, because we're always going to give the train the right of way, because that's the way the rules work. So maybe in that transportation hierarchy, I should put railroad on top of everything else, because that is kind of the real story.
That is the truth. That's very much the truth. US, yeah. The train always wins.
It's hard to stop a train unless they're stopped, and then it's really frustrating when they're stopped and people start climbing through them, that is not a safe condition. I worry about that a lot.
Well, what's
Nightmares,
worse
I
is when
tell you,
you're in the middle.
nightmares.
What's worse is when you're in the middle of a race, and I've done many races across the city, and you're timed, and your time against the train, and so when you're at a stop, the times keep going. So yeah. So that was another question that came out.
Yeah, that bridge is open, so the crossing is open. Of course, the problem with the crossing is, now we have an elevator that we have to maintain, and that's, outdoor elevators. That's tricky. If you think traffic signals are hard to maintain, and I can tell you they are hard to maintain, elevators may be even harder to maintain. Megan, Southwest Montgomery. Yeah, another good one. Portland State, a good partner, advocated for the closure of Southwest Montgomery. And, that's just one of those, we have to have, adjacent, it's really helpful to have adjacent property owners and advocates asking those questions. Okay, a couple more. Ross Island Bridge. It's one of my, such a challenging area. So Riley, thanks for that question. This is maybe the most studied area in the history of the city. And there's another ongoing study right now, of course, the Southwest Corridor light rail work that started back in 1978. It was a 2001 study, 2010 study, a 2013 study. I mean, we're studying it again. So yeah, if that's an active, there's actually an open house, I think, just last week. So if you're interested in that, that Ross Island Bridge is complicated. It's complicated partly because ODOT owns the bridge and a lot of the approaches, so the city can only do so much. And so the trade-offs between what the city wants to do and what ODOT thinks is the right thing to do, we do tend to have differing opinions on things. So Riley, that's a fun set of spaghetti there. And then the last one I had was from Josh, and bike lane ends. Boy, this is, talk about a perfect thing to end on. It's something I talked about a little bit in my presentation. Definitely we talk about this, and this is the one where, we really, really will benefit from, if you're biking out there and you see things, we do have a little bit of money in the PBOT Missing Links program. So if you were to call up, one of the things you could say is, well, gosh, I'd really like this to be on the Missing Links program. I know you have a little bit of funding. Could you just, make this connection, just extend this bike lane? I have a couple myself that I've put in there. And of course, in this era, we will be trying to make sure that program is focused a bit more than it ever has before on equity. So thinking about, okay, if you're from part of the community that maybe is in a more affluent part of town, we have to think about, okay, how do we respond to your request versus somebody that maybe isn't that well off and needs the treatment. So these are the sorts of things we try to prioritize to the level best. And of course, equity is another angle that we're, really, really emphasizing the use and trying to understand how best to prioritize, which, again, we traditionally, it's something that we can always improve upon. Okay, a couple things in the chat. So yeah, I think that was all the ones I had. I'll go look in the email and see if I can find the other ones. But if you want to jump in the chat and just add them to that, that's great too.
Yeah, I can jump in the chat. I can add them in the chat. So Nick, or I can just talk. So Nick Hodge asked a question, and the biggest complaint really was the crosswalk along the busy streets, such as Southeast Tacoma, between the Selwood Bridge and Southeast 13th. And very little signage or crosswalk painting on that street, so it can make traveling confusing.
Oh, Southeast Tacoma, that's my neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Says
so
it's often
I would
confusing.
say
Yeah.
We've made improvements on Southeast Tacoma over time. Always happy to hear from a neighbor. It used to be a 4-lane, I would call it a road sewer that carried a lot more traffic. But yeah, so there's been some crosswalk improvements. I would like to see 11th as a crosswalk as well. It's pretty busy through there. I think that's a 3-lane cross section. And I think when the community went through, there was some talk about restricting the lefts, but I think we chose not to. Yeah, it's a fun one. I don't know. It's definitely not as safe as it should be, but it's safer than so many intersections in outer East Portland. I'd say that's probably lower on our list. And I think the crash history isn't. I'm trying to think. I don't know if I've seen the crash history recently.
Would it be safer since the bridge has been retrofitted? The traffic pattern would have changed. I don't bike out there enough to know.
Yeah, the traffic, we didn't really add capacity with the bridge. We just kind of maintained it. I mean, they added a little bit, but it's still limited by the signal at 13. So that's the good news. We didn't add we didn't make it so inviting that a lot more traffic came down Tacoma.
Okay. Another question came from James, and he asked, why do lane markings and road markings in general in the Portland metro area have such poor visibility and reflectivity? And
Yeah,
of course, it gets worse during night and rain and snow conditions.
Yeah, there's a great bit of work on that. That's really a function of, okay, so we choose with our maintenance dollars to prioritize painting the markings. Paint is only so effective. It's not as good as thermoplastic, but it's easier to install. The challenge with paint is also the wear and tear that happens with road markings, with studded tires especially. So studded tires has an impact on pavement, but it similarly has a pretty significant impact on paint. So that's part of our challenge is, the notion of the wear and tear that's happening when people are obviously driving over it with studded tires.
Yeah. So the next question comes from Mariah, I'm sorry. And this is near and dear to where I grew up. And it's the section of Northeast 43rd between Sandy and Tillamook, and specifically the intersection at Tillamook and 43rd. There's been so much work in that neighborhood, that Hollywood neighborhood, and it's been such a bypass neighborhood in terms of traffic versus the community that it once was. I remember seeing it in the 80s. So yeah, I think it's a great question. I'd love for you to talk about that one, Peter, because I also, there's been a lot of work in that over maybe 15, 20 years. Do you remember what it was versus how it is now?
So my family's favorite restaurant was Poor Richard's, which is right there. Anybody, if you're familiar with that area, that's a throwback name.
Wow.
So yes, 43rd, that's an interesting area. The Whole Foods came in recently, so that added some traffic. Quite a bit of development going on in there. I think that area, of course, Sandy Boulevard is a challenging arterial for us. It was last looked at, I think, in probably the early 2000s, maybe even late 90s. That we restrict a lot of left turns to keep traffic flowing. That's definitely an area that could use a little assessment of are all these restrictions, are all those changes, all the things that we did, are all those little hook turns and things, are those really necessary? Rethinking things less from a mobility lens and more from this is where people want to go, as opposed to getting people through, is really a direction I'd love to spend some time on if there was a planning study that could be done. It's hard when there's so much development happening and there's so dynamic of a neighborhood, and so that's one that's a tough one for sure.
Yeah. No, I know
Michael, man, yeah, Poor Richard's Twoffers. Oh, that's too funny.
So the last question that was sent in right before class started was from Emmy, and it's essentially the same thing as the train. So we've addressed it already, but the one that she specifically asked about is the steel bridge going north on NATO to the west side, and the other one is Clinton on Clinton 12th in southeast.
Clinton 12th and southeast. Boy, that's a tough
one.
That is the toughest intersection I've ever helped to design, for sure. That there were so many unique challenges associated with building a light rail line next to the heavy rail. And then, of course, the busway that came in, and then, and the bike facility as well. So preemption, the preemption causes, there's so much advanced time that's necessary there that often I'm at the intersection and I can blame everything on the train, because often when the train comes, we're preparing for that train, and that train warning is, the early train request can be 74 seconds in advance of the train arriving. And then the other part of that is then we get train requests that never get served. We call those ghost trains, because the trains were in between Brooklyn Yard and the Holgate Yard. And so they'll request a preemption, but they'll never show up. And so we have a lot of data on that, and that's been a head scratcher for us, is how do we help improve that, because that makes us so that we look like we don't know what we're doing. And so if you're on 12th at Clinton, or if you're on Clinton at 12th, it's not ideal.
Thank you, Peter. So that's all we have for the complaints and the extra ones. There are two specific questions that I want to go through in the chat that I think are really good to talk through. But I also want to make time for you and Allison for those who have questions from Allison's presentation. But let's take a look at this one from Julie. She talked about the Clinton Bridge. What does it take to get a street closed? So she wonders about the one block.
Just a couple barriers.
Oh, you're talking about permanently closed, Julie.
I feel like it's spoken a lot. So if there's other people, I was just wondering about the coming off the St. John's Bridge on the west side. There's like, the road goes for 1 block and then it intersects with Lombard. And it goes right through like the heart of downtown St. John's. And that street is often closed off for farmers markets and things. And it just seems so weird that it's there as a through street when there's other ways 1 block away to get to Lombard.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the challenge is mostly just inertia. I mean, I think that's, and maybe ODOT's, it's always hard to know what streets are whose jurisdiction. That's definitely part of the challenge. If it's ODOT, they're a little bit, they're always just, maybe a request that comes in the city and the city doesn't know what to do with it because it is ODOT's.
Which actually goes to the second question, and this came from Robin, is how are those jurisdictional transfer conversations going to help with ODOT and PBOT design preferences?
Yeah, I figured Robin would ask the hard questions. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. The jurisdiction transfers. So what that is, for those of you that, well, I guess I don't know if you guys have talked about that, but I think the part of that that's interesting is, so ODOT owns old highways. Earl Blumenauer would call them orphaned highways, and so that's kind of that's a distinction that's made, of course, and the nuance of that is interesting from a traffic signal standpoint. I guess I'll just talk about it from that point of view, is that we end up, ODOT will pay the city to maintain those signals the way it's set up today. And with a jurisdictional transfer, that will change to, so that they give the city the street, which means that the street has to then be maintained for the rest of its life by the city. So if you think about it it's like I live in my house, I ask you to maintain the roof on my house. And do you want to pay for that? And the answer is, well, I'd love for you to maintain the roof on my house. I just maintained it, but 30 years from now, I'm going to have to put a new roof on the house. And if you would pay for it, that'd be great. I'd love that. So it's just one of those, when we think about the ongoing maintenance, there's some of that. I think those are arguments and discussions are pieces of the puzzle that are sometimes they're hard conversations to have, because the ongoing maintenance, I'm sure you've heard or you will hear in the future that we're not keeping up with all the maintenance. I mean, we are not like the Netherlands in that regard. The Netherlands, they fund infrastructure, they fund many things, and government functions a little better than we do. So that's kind of one of our challenges as we go forward, is thinking about, if we take on more maintenance, can we keep up? And the answer right now for the city is that we're having a hard time keeping up with all the maintenance needs. I did see, a couple of some of the other favorite signals. 11th and Koonce, pedestrian scramble. That's an interesting one. That scramble, I don't tend to be an advocate for pedestrian scrambles, because it tends to. It's good when you're able to walk everywhere. It's good, but the short answer to that is it actually drives the cycle length up, because then we have to provide for the cars. So there's actually sometimes more delay for pedestrians. But that is a location where we actually are really close to 11th and Burnside, and so it actually makes sense to have that there. But some of the residents don't like it, so it's been an interesting conversation of, should we keep it? Should we change it? What should we do with that one? I remember somebody else said, 12th and Burnside was a fun one. They liked that one. We have 57th and Sandy was another one. That was a bike signal, so that was a good location. Interstate in Oregon, that's actually one of my favorites, the Dutch style, and then also I think somebody mentioned Broadway as well.
So should we open up the class to the rest of the presentations, not just the complaints? I'd like to also bring up Alison again, if anybody has specific questions on her presentation regarding coronavirus and the data. But Carrie started a really great thread on the chat to ask folks to put their favorite intersections. So I'm just letting people contribute and talk about what their favorite intersections are. But yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the questions regarding the two presentations, or how could we do better?
Yeah, and people already asked a ton of great questions in the chat. I think that we got to most of them, but yeah, if there are any others, please let us know.
Yeah, so Nick, I see Nick has raised his hand.
Hey, do you want to just jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. Okay, cool. I was curious if you could talk more about the Safe Streets Healthy Businesses permits. I know someone touched, I think a few people have asked about, like, what does it take to shut down a street permanently? And Peter, you talked about how it's difficult to decouple cars from businesses, and a lot of business owners think they need that. Have you seen anything so far? Do you think this is a good opportunity to kind of capitalize the momentum and keep some of these places closed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's never been a better time than right now to talk about needing outdoor space. I know one of the issues that the city is trying to work on is how do we permit heaters in the right of way. Early on in my tenure with the city, there was a person in my group actually that was very, very against lighting over the sidewalk. He thought it was a safety hazard, electrical safety hazard, to let people have extension cords over over where people would walk. And it was kind of a okay, well, there is a concern there, but is it, how many people have been hurt or electrocuted by that? And the answer is none. So we need to figure out how do we be a little more flexible and not so caught up in the one potential safety issue. So we're trying to sort that out, having propane heaters in the right of way. Yeah, we don't, there's some questions about having, propane heaters within a foot of a moving cyclist or somebody biking, but or driving even. I think those are things that are solvable, and definitely now is a good time to, you need space. Restaurants obviously don't have the indoor space that that they need to be as as profitable or even to make it. So I think the city is definitely willing to try to find creative ways to make them whole.
Cool. Thank you.
Mariah.
Let's jump in. Thank you. The question, kind of on that, what would it take to close, maybe not close the street, but close down parking options? Because I know a lot of places have kind of moved into that with the COVID restrictions.
Yeah, it's a permit, and it's actually a no-fee permit right now. So I think the city has done a really nice job of trying to make sure that that's as easy as possible. Of course, there's a few, there's some things that we ask, and there are a couple early applications that actually the implementations were encroaching into the right-of-way, or into the travel way. So, and there's one that I've even complained about that I was like, well, there used to be some place I could bike next to the car or get by the car there. Now I can't. So, these are the sorts of things like, okay, it's all public space. So what are we willing to do with that space? And I mean, in general, I really love the street seats. I think we have to find ways to help. I think there's some equity questions about, okay, we're giving public space to business owners. Is this good? And so, and do they all, should they all be accessible in every element of that? So that these are hard. Some of those are hard questions. And generally, I think we're trying to make it so that, they are accessible. So there are some restrictions to what the business owner can do.
I also think this is a great opportunity to talk about your class project if anybody wants to share. Or even ask our traffic division engineer and Alison, like, how do you navigate through this and help with your project? So we still have time. We have about 9 minutes left of class. So I just wanted to open that up. You are working on your projects, right?
I've kind of had a lot of questions tonight, but I have another one if you don't mind, and it doesn't
Sure.
really have anything to do with my project actually. But I have been thinking about the closing of the streets for businesses, and it doesn't matter today. So I was just riding through Clinton and 26th, that intersection where they closed the block there, and one of the the equity things. And this is coming from a white person who rides around Portland, so there's that. But so there's my perspective. But we do have so many roads for cars, and then we blocked off Clinton for street seating, which is lovely. It's great. It's great. But and then the cycling area is really narrow, and I'm really afraid that someday I'm going to hit somebody riding through there because it is so narrow. And I think about like an equity from a road use perspective. If I'm already riding on a greenway and I'm not really, I don't want to be on Division, and then we close the road to cars, which is again lovely, but it's like there's almost less room for me as a cyclist in some ways. And so that's I don't really have a good answer to that question. It's like it's almost all positive but sort of negative at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's minimum distances, and that we want to maintain. I think how to communicate that to the road users and the street users, the people that are sitting there and even if you have people, I mean, the one I've been to a couple times now is the 28th and Ankeny with the rainbow crosswalks. They did a nice, not crosswalks, rainbow markings that kind of delineated the bike facility. And to me, they felt pretty ample in terms of making that comfortable. And so I don't know the one on 26th and Clinton, but yeah, the distances and then, the maintenance of those is, I think, important to figure out, what is the right width that will make it work for everybody. So I didn't answer your question, but I guess, it's probably worth thinking through. And
I don't think
maybe
I
I'll
really
go over
had a-
there.
I didn't really
Maybe
have a
I'll go over
question.
there and take a nice bike ride tomorrow to go look, because
Yeah, go
I'm
check
serving
out Clinton
the
26.
residents in Portland.
It feels a little narrow, just want to say to me, but that's just, I'm kind of a fast cyclist and I just don't want to hit somebody. And so.
I'd love to just close the class with giving such great gratitude to Peter and Alison for their time tonight. It was wonderful. We learned a lot. It's kind of like traffic engineering 101, really. Then the question
Good.
is right? The question is do you want to be an engineer or a planner or a policy person? There's so many ways to enter this profession. And last year I had students who applied for the MERT program here at PSU and other programs that came out of this class. So I want to talk a little bit about your project. Specifically, I don't plan on having any more, not anymore, but for next week, I think I don't have a homework assignment. Next week we have my colleagues from the nonprofits who's going to come in and talk about how they advocate for transportation. And it is essentially like 2 days after election. So I hope you all get your votes in, which is really, really important. We'll see how things shape up nationally and globally and locally. It'll be very interesting. But yeah, so I don't intend on having a homework assignment, but I really do want you to focus on your projects, get up to speed with that. And we should do a check-in on your projects and continue on the scavenger hunt. I think some of you are having a lot of fun with the scavenger hunt and navigating and going around the city and taking pictures. So we'll work on that piece. And yeah, I'd like to get a round of applause for Peter and Alison. I think it's fantastic. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience and your diligence in answering all those questions. Yeah.
My pleasure. It's always great to get good questions and feedback, and yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, it's been awesome. So I hope you can tune in again some more. More to be had, and I'll invite you and all of our guest speakers for towards the end for student presentations. We're still working on that format and everything, but I think it's been great. I've learned a lot. Even as a civil engineer, a former traffic person who did all these analysis way back when. And Peter and I went to high school together, if you could believe that. It was so much fun. So we really know the city really well. Yeah, so I had mentioned to Carrie and others that I'll stick around, but feel free to hop off. Class is essentially over, but I just want to thank you for your time, your diligence, and just being with us through the last few sessions. But Carrie, yeah, if you want, in order to capture some of the, what do you call that? Chat notes, if you like, you can do a copy and paste. That's what I normally do if I want to capture the chat notes. But yeah, this is recorded and streamed. And if you want to watch the videos again, feel free to do so.